Hello and welcome to episode 436 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert. It's always Damien Fay and me, Andy Leakes. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm good. Well, we had a break because of the half term and it was probably just as well because listeners can probably hear in my voice that I was actually ill for most of that week. So I took some time off to spend with the family and it was bad luck that the entire family pretty much got sick at the same time with a heavy cold, and so I spent a couple of those days in bed. But on a positive note for podcast listeners, it means that they didn't miss an episode. It was because I probably wouldn't have been able to do it anyway. So I'm back feeling better, so that is a real positive. And of course my hand is still improving, so that is another positive thing. I'm going to start driving again. I've had a couple of weeks where I've not been driving, actually being driven around by my wife, which obviously as somebody who's not the best passenger has been a bit of a learning curve. So yep, it's good to be back, Andy.
Yeah, well, it's good to be back and, at least one of us is feeling healthy because I feel lovely and rested. Shall we get cracking on with what we've got talking about this week? I imagine we've got three pieces again.
So this week we are doing the usual three pieces. We're going to do a piece on Vanguard because interestingly after the last episode there was a lot of feedback because I know a lot of people like Vanguard and their products, but some people wrote in because Vanguard have launched a new product which is a managed ISA and they wanted to know what that was all about. So rather than you pick and choose funds, you can actually get them to run a portfolio for you. So we're going to talk about that on the podcast this week. Then Andy's going to do a piece on cashback apps. Now, we've done that a couple of years ago, actually 3 years ago, almost to the day, we did an episode talking about cashback apps. But there's been a bit of an innovation in that space, something different that we've seen launched in the last few months, which actually raises the appeal of cashback apps for the team. And the final piece I'm going to be doing is on interest rates. So it's a little bit contemporary, does date that part of the podcast, but as people may be aware, the Bank of England kept the base rate at 5.25%. And the question now is, are we at the peak? Are interest rates going to be falling in the near future, or are we going to see more hikes, or are we going to be just stuck there for an extended period of time? So I'm going to talk all about that and the implications for savers and mortgage borrowers.
Okay, so let's start with the first piece of the podcast then, and we're going to be talking about Vanguard again, and they've launched a new product. We've taken a look at it, Damien, and we're going to be covering it on this week's pod.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, we will be publishing next week a greater in-depth look on this particular product. But what it is, Vanguard, as people will know, have a range of funds and ETFs that people can access through existing platforms. And we talked about the Vanguard Life Strategy Funds last week and alternatives. Well, Vanguard has now launched a managed ISA. So previously what you would do via your platform, it could be via the Vanguard Investor platform, you can go and buy a range of ETFs and funds and build your own portfolio essentially, and it was obviously very low cost. But as we've done the analysis, there are ways where you could even hold Vanguard funds more cheaply on other platforms if you have a portfolio of a certain size. But of course, while Vanguard is attractive to people, there was always that group of investors who maybe aren't as confident about choosing their own portfolio, constructing a diversified mix of assets. And so Vanguard have really entered the market with a managed ISA where essentially they provide ready-made portfolios off the shelf, which they then run. And there's 5 portfolios within the managed ISA. Now, this product has been sort of lurking in the background, but it's now at the front of their website. So they're pushing this quite heavily. They're majoring on this because obviously it's an attractive proposition for people who do want to invest at low cost, but would like the decisions to be taken away from them, be made by somebody else when it comes to management. Now, Andy is our guru for all things to do with pricing and the different options with different platforms. So I'm going to run through some bits about the managed ISA just to give people a flavour of it, because some people have written in and asked us, what is it? Is it any good? Now, I've played around with it. I've looked. You can go through and actually, without registering, go through the onboarding journey up to the point where you would actually put money in on their platform. So you can go and look at a Vanguard managed ISA and see what happens. So it's quite interesting. When you go and do the journey, it's slightly different to others that you have out there. So some of the robo-advice propositions, because this managed ISA, in my view, puts them in direct competition with the likes of people like Money Farm, Nut, Nutmeg, Wealthify, people who have these managed propositions, so these robo-advice propositions, because it is a low-cost solution that's kind of off the shelf. You get a portfolio that's ready made. Now, when you go through, the way their onboarding journey works, they kind of risk assess you by giving you a scenario where there's a chart and you choose how much you would be willing to effectively risk for the potential upside that's shown. Now, the UX, that user experience, I would say isn't that great, because then the next question is another version of the one you've just had, but with different numbers. So what you're essentially doing is telling it how much you're willing to risk for a potential upside that's shown on screen, but it does feel like sometimes things haven't changed that much unless you're paying attention. So I quite liked it though, because lots of the robo-advice propositions will have some very vague, almost woolly questions that some people might find a little bit difficult to give an answer for. For example, if the market was to crash 10%, would that cause you to sell out? Well, that's very hypothetical, and I think this is much more analytical because it's numbers based. And what happens, you go through that journey, and then essentially it tells you what kind of investor that you are from a scale of 1 to 5, which is basically going from cautious to adventurous, and then it represents a portfolio on there that matches with that particular risk profile, which you can then choose. It's not advice, that's an important point. You can then choose to go and buy that managed ISA, that portfolio, which obviously Vanguard then manages in the background, so it's much more active than the other propositions which are very passive propositions, so the ETFs or the Vanguard Life Strategy Fund. Now, from that point of view, it is quite interesting. What I do like, which I think is going to be a bit of an innovation in this space now, and I'm all for it, is they cap the charges that are applied to the investment. So the way their pricing works is that there is a 0.15% annual account fee plus a 0.3% annual management fee, so actually running the portfolio. So it's effectively like a platform fee plus and a management fee for running the portfolio, and then that's 0.45%, but of course then there's the underlying fund charges as well, so that's around about 0.15%. Now that's the sort of thing that you would see elsewhere. There'd be the fund fees, but there'd also be a overall fee which normally includes the annual management fee for running a portfolio and the platform charge. That will be all included if you look at other robo-advice propositions. What is interesting is that a bit like the Vanguard Investor Platform, where they cap their platform charges, so they have a 0.15% platform charge which is capped at £375 a year max it can be. They're using that kind of principle here. So what they do is they cap that 0.45, so the effective account fee, which is like the platform charge, and the management fee for running the portfolio, which is the 0.3, so that combo of 0.45, that is capped, and that means that can't get any more than £1,125 a year, which where the cap will kick in is if you had around £250,000 on that platform in a managed ISA. But crucially, the fund fees aren't capped, because the fund fee is something separate, so the more you have, the more the fee will be, and of course it's only 0.15%. Now that is interesting. I think that is innovative, and I hope we're going to see that sort of bleed over into other propositions in this space. So on that regard, it's quite attractive. Now, the first thing I'm going to have to throw out there is that the drawbacks are you've only got access to the Vanguard universe within that managed ISA. So they're only going to be putting your money in Vanguard products. There is still no lifetime ISA on the Vanguard platform. There are only 5 portfolios. If you look at across the board and look at things like Nutmeg, for example, they have a whole range of portfolios, including 10 normal, I'd say standard portfolios. They have another 10 ethical portfolios, and they have another range of managed portfolios. But interestingly, there's been a lot of innovation in the last few weeks actually in this space. That Money Farm and Nutmeg have launched something called thematic investing. Now, we'll probably talk about this more in the future, but I'm quite excited about the idea of thematic investing. Now, it's not what most people will think, where you get a general theme and they're just going to say, I don't know, will it be something to do with the environment, and they kind of use that to invest in accordance with that in your portfolio. Thematic investing is a little bit more subtle. This is the definition that the robos are using, so Money Farm and Nutmeg. What they will do is they will build a diversified portfolio, but typically they might take 20% of, say, the equity exposure and have a tilt towards one of the themes. So in the case of Nutmeg, one of their themes is to do with technology, and within that can be having exposure to the growth of AI. So think about having a diversified or globally diversified portfolio, but then a portion has a bit of a tilt towards something that you might like potentially the future of AI and its usage. Now that is quite interesting. Now, At the moment, Vanguard doesn't have anything like that. This is a much more simple product that they're launching for people. But it is interesting. And I think cost-wise, it is comparable with other options out there. I mean, like I said, the all-in 0.45 plus the fund fees, you're looking around about 0.6%. Now, that's broadly in the region of some of the robo-advice propositions out there, let's say Wealthify, for example, but then you've got to add their fund fee on top of that. So it does come under marginally the robo-advice propositions standard portfolios, because you've got to think when the robo-advice propositions have, say, like ethical portfolios, they are more expensive. So there is a lot to like with the Vanguard option. The managed ISA doesn't have a performance history, whereas we've got plenty of performance history with the likes of Money Farm, Wealthify, Nutmeg, and we have that on the Money to Masses website and we analyse it. So we'll put a link to that particular article actually. If you want to find out reviews of all the other propositions out there, then you can find that by searching on the Money to Masses website. But you can access that via the article that looks at performance numbers. So overall, I think the Vanguard option is going to be interesting as we go into Q1. It is fairly limited, but it does give you access to low cost investing. Now, one of the things I would say when I looked at the portfolios that it suggests, you can't see the actual ETFs or the funds that it does invest in. So it could be up to 12. Now, I don't know how many it will invest in if you buy the portfolio. I don't know how that would deviate, for example, be different to something like a life strategy fund, but it does look like it's going to be pretty much equity and bonds once again, which is slightly limiting in diversification because some of the other robos, for example, will invest in slightly different assets too. So it is interesting. Keep an eye out on the Money to Masses website for a full review of it. So I've given an overview there of the proposition, which I think some people will be interested in. But there are clearly, Andy, going to be people who won't be interested in this proposition because of some of the other changes we've seen in this space.
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, it's interesting to see Vanguard is entering this space, but the other alternatives out there are still going to be preferential for certain type of investors. For example, the minimum investment is quite prohibitive for some people. You need a minimum £500 to invest on the Vanguard platform. Of course, lots of other places, Wealthify, Doddle, you can invest from just £1. And of course, those options as well, like Doddle, you can invest in individual shares, which again, you can't do through Vanguard. So yeah, watch this space. We'll see how it develops. It is very new. We have no performance data yet. We'll see how it develops and perhaps we'll revisit this in a year's time.
And yeah, just a final point on that. You have to view this in the round. If you want to invest in things like investment trusts, you might want to invest with different fund houses, for example, then there are platforms like Interactive Investor, which you can do that. And that has in itself become cheaper, as we've covered in the podcast recently. I think the message is, I think the investment space as we go into Q1 of 2024 is going to get quite exciting because the investment platforms are having to do something different to acquire customers in a world where you can get very attractive rates on savings accounts. So they're all trying to do something to attract new customers. And I think that will be to the benefit of UK investors. So moving on to the next piece of the podcast, Andy, Cashback apps. So as I mentioned in the intro of this podcast, 3 years ago, we covered Cashback apps on, I think it was podcast 290. So we'll put a link in the notes so people can go back and listen to that episode if they want. But there's a whole host of cashback apps that we talked about back then. And I'm just looking at them as we make this podcast. There were things like Shopmium, Airtime Rewards, Top Cashback. And so we'll put a link to an article that we've updated recently that talks about them. But a lot of those apps work by you having to take out special offers. So you might check an app, for example, and you look and there may be something on there that you might want to buy. And if the stars align, there's something that you want and they're offering a deal with cashback, you can then use those apps to be able to gain that cashback, which has always been something that has jarred with me personally and why I don't particularly use any of these cashback apps. So I know we talk about sites like Top Cashback and they're incredibly popular for people earning quite sizable cashback amounts. But again, it's one of those things that you have to remember to use them. And do they have an offer when you're trying to buy something in particular? They work really well if you're trying to do things like maybe switch broadband, for example. But There have been a few new apps that you've been looking at that we've written reviews about as well that we'll put in the notes of the podcast that do things slightly differently, aren't there?
Yeah, that's right. So there's been a bit of an innovation, and just sort of taking your point further as to the sites like Top Cashback and Quidco, who are extremely popular, as you said. Another criticism of those type of cashback apps is the way that they track the cashback and the way that they pay it, because often what you'll have to do is you'll have to wait at least a couple of weeks, if not in some cases a few months, because the system has to track via various codes back to the original retailer. Then that retailer needs to accept that, check it, and there's a lot of technical things that go in between the two things happening, and then eventually you might get your cash back.
Yeah, and I don't want to name and shame, because I'm not going to name which site it was, but I did have a scenario where I used one of them when I switched broadband, should have got £80 cash back, and we went back and forth when I was appealing because it got rejected, and there was absolutely no reason why it should have got rejected, and ultimately after 6 months I was still trying to get the cash back, and in the end I never did. So I've always become slightly wary of the cashback you're going to get. Yes, you should get it, but there are, like you said, Andy, there are always instances, and sometimes it's not as smooth as it perhaps could be.
That's right. And so these latest cashback apps that we've been reviewing and that we're talking about now on the podcast are interesting because they are cashback apps that provide instant cashback rewards. Now that's interesting because that means that you can tangibly see in your account immediately the amount of money that you're earning, and actually that money can then be spent immediately or withdrawn into your own bank account. So like I say, instant cashback. That's interesting. So what are we talking about here? Well, there's two in particular that we're going to focus on in the podcast. There may well be others out there that are soon to launch because it seems to be a bit of a movement at the moment. So let's focus on two cashback apps in particular. The first is Jam Donut and the second is Hyperjar. Now you may have heard of Hyperjar before because it's a prepaid card that you can download via an app and you can use it to pay pocket money to your children, spend money abroad without the fees. It's a really versatile app, but they've included now this new way of earning cashback. So Hyperjar is one and Jam Donut is the other. Now here is the differentiator. Here is what they do. They allow you to go onto the apps and select from a number of retailers. Now, both of them have a wide selection of retailers. Jam Donut's got slightly more, around about 150. Now, these are retailers that you would use in your normal everyday spend.
So Andy's insights here are not hypothetical because Andy's actually been using them this week and earning cash back. And you had a good example that you explained to me earlier in the week about Costa Coffee.
Yeah, absolutely. So I haven't really explained how it works yet. So the way that it works is you search the app for places that you want to spend money, and then rather than make a purchase through the app, you actually buy a preloaded gift card and then you use that gift card to make the purchase. So I'll give you a scenario. Costa was a brilliant example, Damien. I did that earlier in the week. I didn't need to, let's be honest. I wanted to get myself a coffee and my wife. I was on the school run, rushing backwards and forwards. I thought, right, I'll grab a coffee. And I thought, right, I'm going to check Jam Donut. I'm sure they're on there. So I went into the Jam Donut app. Lo and behold, 9.5% cash back. So I went ahead and purchased a gift card. I actually loaded £30 onto that. The reason being, I thought, yeah, my coffee's only going to cost, £5 or £6, but I go in there roughly 3 or 4 times a month. It's about a month's worth of coffee in my mind. That's what I was thinking. Bought the gift card. And so immediately I had that cashback showing in the app, £2.85, which is roughly a free coffee straight away. And so I did that as I was standing outside the shop, walked in and then made my purchase, scanned the gift card, which is in the Jam Donut app, or you can save it to your Apple wallet or your Google wallet. It's quite easy to do that kind of thing. And then walked out, £2.85 better off. And yes, the process is pretty smooth.
So to take that one step further, because maybe people think, well, I don't spend £30 on coffee. Because it happens so smoothly from your experience, you could, in theory, go to your supermarket, and most supermarkets are on there. So you could go and say you're going to do a food shop and you're going to end up knowing you're going to spend over 50 quid. You could buy a £50 voucher before you walk in the door and before you go to the till even, and then pay with that and then pay the difference of your bill with cash or whatever. But then you'll earn cash back straight away that will be appearing in the app. So that's how slick it can be if it works.
Yeah, absolutely. I did exactly that. So Sainsbury's were on an offer in the Jam Donut app. and they had what they call a pumped up offer. And this is what's quite interesting, because every so often, every couple of days, there'll be different offers that sort of arrive and fall away. And so it means that you need to engage with the app to see where the best offers are. So at the moment, at the time of recording, Sainsbury's are only offering, I say only, it's decent, 2% cash back. It's better than nothing. But at the time, a couple of days ago, there was 4% cash back. It was a pumped up offer. And so I knew I was going to Sainsbury's that day. I knew I'd need to spend around about £50 or a little bit more. And so I went in and I bought a £50 Sainsbury's voucher. And because it was pumped up to 4% cash back, immediately I got £2 straight into my account. Now, where it becomes quite interesting is you can stack these offers up. And so if you've got a Nectar card or a club card and you're buying supermarket vouchers, obviously you can scan your club cards and Nectar cards and everything on top of that to earn those extra points rewards that you would normally earn.
And talking of stacking, I know it's often used with reference to, let's say you used a site like Top Cashback, but you had a cashback credit card, something like Amex, for example. They have a number of cashback credit cards. So you could buy something, get cashback on the purchase, but then also get cashback from Amex. So is that stacking method, can you do that with these apps? So could you do it with Jam Donut?
So yeah, absolutely. You can earn stacked rewards by using your normal payment method. If that's a credit card and you prefer to earn the air miles and everything else, just be careful though, because Jam Donut is an app that really wants you to pay via your bank account. They want to try and limit the amount of fees that they pay. And so you'll see it quite clearly on the app. It will say if you do an instant bank transfer transaction, because there are no card fees involved in that, then you get the maximum cashback rewards. If you select to pay by your normal other methods, maybe by Google or Apple Pay, and that links to a credit card, because there's transaction fees involved, your cashback is reduced. So in order to maximize the rewards, think about whether you want to stack them or not, because you might be earning less cashback. But because you're earning cashback elsewhere, it may still work for you. So you just need to think about that.
So that's interesting, because if you're going to buy these vouchers and you're going to pay for these vouchers using a credit card, then you are likely to see reduced rates. But theoretically, you could still get a stacked reward if you had some of the cashback accounts that exist. So Chase, for example, that offer cashback on certain purchases. So you could use an account like that and buy the vouchers via Jam Donut, for example, and therefore you could do that stacking. So it's quite interesting. I mean, what are the downsides? So, I mean, first of all, I'm assuming that you're obviously getting a voucher. So with that comes the caveat that the money is a voucher and the risk associated with having a voucher rather than hard cash.
Yeah, you also need to be mindful of the fact that vouchers do expire. And so if you get a bit sort of cashback crazy and you think, right, I'm going to buy vouchers for, I don't know, my supermarket, for my fuel, and then if you leave it in the app and you forget about it, some of them do expire after a relatively short period of time, maybe even 12, 18 months, so just be careful. Most vouchers these days do have at least 2 years before they expire on them, but at the end of the day, cash doesn't expire, so just be careful of that as well. Another good point to make and be careful of is if you're using these cashback methods in order to earn sizable cashback rewards on big purchases. Let's say, for example, you wanted to buy a top-end bicycle from Halfords. They're currently offering, I think, 4% cashback, and you think, right, that £1,000 bike, I'm going to use the cashback. I'm going to buy myself a gift card, if you like, or a series of gift cards to earn the maximum cashback rewards. And then you go and buy that bike, and then you realize that it's not right for you. You didn't like it, or you've probably overspent on that. And then in terms of actually returning that item, with gift cards, it's very different to cash. You won't get cash back into your account. The likelihood is you'll get refunds in the form of vouchers. Now, do you want £1,000 worth of vouchers sitting in your account when you realise that you don't actually want a bike in the first place? There is limitations with this.
But of course, if you're somebody like me, because one of the things I'm always thinking when I buy something, I think, I didn't go and check whether you could do it by a cashback site, whether it was on offer, those kind of things. And as I said earlier, often a lot of people can't be bothered. Where this is kind of interesting is because if you're going to go and do your food shop and then on the way there you suddenly think, I could get cash back, you could then immediately buy the voucher and immediately use it, which limits that time frame in which your money is in that virtual world, because you could actually use it as you shop. I remember you said there are warnings that occasionally some of the retailers can take a little bit of time for the voucher to come through, like an hour, for example. Mostly it's instant in your experience, but they do put a warning about that on the app, don't they? And the other thing I just wanted to ask is, okay, so you earn all this cash back. Where does it go? Is it in the app? Can you take it out as actual money into your bank account?
Yeah, so Jam Donut have an amount that you need to earn before you can start withdrawing that cash back as cash, and that's £10 currently. But they do give you a £2 reward just for signing up for the app. When you make your first purchase, they give you an extra 200 points, which converts to £2. So you're already starting the ball rolling with £2 in there. It doesn't take long, to be honest, to get up to £10, but you do need to be mindful of that. You can't just withdraw the money straight away. Once you've hit the £10, you're absolutely fine to go. Hyperjar, they don't have any limitations to how much cash back you need to earn. The money goes straight back into your wallet, which you can use to spend anywhere. And actually what I quite like about the Hyperjar app is because it goes back into your wallet, if you use that app for pocket money for your children, which I do, you can then just siphon that money into the children's savings for pocket money and bits and pieces, which is what I did when I used that app myself. So that was quite interesting.
So these are interesting apps. I think it's definitely worth bringing it to the podcast just because they are attractive to a certain part of the market who maybe aren't into that, said Quidco, and trying to use apps and keep checking them. But the idea of that they suddenly think, oh, actually, can I get cash back? Also, there are people out there who might not want to get a new cashback credit card, or they can't get a credit card for reasons of their credit report, for example, or don't want to open up a new bank account for whatever reason with somebody like Chase. So it is another way of being able to get cashback, and actually quite generous cashback at that. So we have put reviews of both apps in the notes of this show. So of course, these also offer a slightly unusual way of buying gift vouchers. Lots of people want to buy gift vouchers at Christmas. So there is that interesting dynamic there, because the whole system behind these two apps and the way they work is you're buying gift cards. You theoretically could buy gift cards for people using these apps and get cash back as well. I mean, there is on the Jam Donut app. I mean, I think it's a bit gimmicky personally, but they do daily giveaways of like a big wheel, like the Wheel of Fortune, and they spin it. And if you're watching the app, you can win a small cash prize. And Andy, you won £5. I'm not going to promote that kind of idea of sitting there watching an app to try and win money, but you did. But just to round off then, how much cashback have you earned in the days that you've been using them? Because this isn't a promo for these apps. It's just to say to people that it can work for some. And how much have you earned?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a promo for these. Obviously, this is part of our job. This is what we do. So we have to test these things. So I've been testing the app over the last 10 days or so. And including my welcome bonus and then that £5 you just mentioned, I've got about £15 sitting in there at the moment. And look, I've done some quick calculations. If I was to stick with it over the year, without changing my spending habits, by just buying the things I would normally buy, and what I've included there is things like my coffee, I shop at Sainsbury's, I eat out roughly once a month, I shop at Amazon, I get petrol from Morrison's down the road and that's on the app as well, go to the cinema. All of these things you can earn cash back on. I've roughly worked it out to about £420 a year, and again I've kind of rounded down a little bit on that, so that is a realistic figure that over the course of the year that you could earn. So monthly, that'll, what, I don't know, £30 to £40 a month if you were to use it regularly.
Yeah, so you'd have to be a dedicated user and have to remember to do it each time. And I think there is an argument that some people would become a little bit tired of that process because it isn't as slick as it perhaps could be if you were just using your cashback credit card and you're just buying things and then you get the cash back. But it may be of interest to some people. Like I say, read the reviews, all the pros and cons are in there, the sort of limitations, etc. So I enjoyed that piece, Andy. It's definitely given, I think, some listeners food for thought.
Okay, so moving on to the last piece of the pod then, Damien, we had another interest rate announcement this week, and the announcement was that they were to keep rates as they were at 5.25%, which wasn't unexpected, but what does that really mean? Have we hit the peak?
So that is the question and why I wanted to do it on the podcast, because it's a definitive point in this journey that we've been on with these consecutive rate hikes that we've gone from 0.1% all the way up to 5.25% since December 2021. So we had 14 consecutive rate rises and we've had 2 pauses. So we had the last meeting, which was actually in September, they didn't hike. They just kept the base rate at 5.25%, done the same in November. We got another meeting in December this year. And now the market's predictions of where the base rate will go in the future have been changing massively this year. So if you go back to the start of the year, the market was predicting that the base rate wouldn't get above 4.5%, and we are where we are. But what we've seen in recent weeks is the market now start to think that the base rate will be higher for longer. So I published charts on the Maintain Massive website, and we'll put a link to an article that talks about whether you should fix your mortgage or not, which actually has that image in there, and it shows how the predictions have changed over time. And where we are now is the market has been predicting for like a few weeks that we are at the peak, and that actually the base rate will stay around 5% until the end of 2024, so a whole year of this. And then even after that, the base rate will start to come down, but in 5 years' time, the market still thinks it will be at 4%. So that is definitely a higher for longer scenario. So people who are now thinking about remortgaging, what's interesting, the dynamic has changed. So where consumers, I think, generally believe that, right, if we hit the peak, rates will start coming back down again, the market is actually predicting that isn't going to be the case. We've actually hit a plateau. It's a bit more like Table Mountain. We got to the peak, and now we're going to be at this flat period for a while. Of course, market predictions are often wrong, but the Bank of England even said it after their rate decision this week, that the base rate will likely have to stay higher for an extended period of time, and they wouldn't be afraid of hiking again if inflation proves sticky. So what it means is that if you are a mortgage borrower that's going to be remortgaging soon, your decision has changed from, say, somebody who was remortgaging 6 months ago because they would have been worried about how high things would go. Individually, you may be worried about how high your mortgage might go, so you might want to fix. But the thing is now, based on the market's prediction, rates could be where they are currently or near where they are currently in 2 years' time. So that changes the dynamic. And so when I've been talking to mortgage brokers, people are now much more interested in tracker mortgages than they were interested in tracker mortgages 6 months ago. It's all people wanting to fix. Offset mortgages are starting to gain appeal. We've talked about that in the past because obviously if you have sizable savings, you have that flexibility of still being able to access them, but it actually helps to reduce the interest that you're paying on your mortgage debt. So the message there is it's really important now to talk to a mortgage broker because there are going to be lots of options that are going to come to the table now that you need to consider, and the overall cost, as we did on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, we are seeing people cut their rates and offer a really attractive interest rate, but they are putting high fees. Now, if you're wondering what the dynamic is on the fixed rate, a 2-year fix is still around about 5.3% if you've got a 60% loan to value. That's the best you're going to get. If you're looking at the average, you're looking at least a percentage point or more above that. 5-year fixes have come down more in the last couple of weeks, and so the best 5-year fix with a 60% loan to value is around 4.85%, which is obviously lower than the 2-year fix. We're in that dynamic now. If you want to fix for 2 years, it's more expensive than fixing for 5, but of course you've got to weigh up that flexibility option, because if rates do come down quicker, if we do suddenly have a recession and the Bank of England is forced to cut rates, you won't benefit if you have a 5-year fix. So that is the dynamic for mortgage borrowers. They need to seek advice because the decision now is a little bit more mixed. It's not going to be a one size fits all. In the past, often people would come off a fixed rate mortgage and just go, I want another fixed rate mortgage. Don't worry about the fee. We just whack it on. It doesn't really matter. And they would sit there and just focus on the rate. You can't do that anymore. You need to think about it and seek advice. The other thing I would say is if you're remortgaging maybe the back end of next year, you do need to be planning for rates to be at the level that they are now. So as we did a podcast, a year and a half ago, when I started telling people to plan, build cash buffers, perhaps to offset the increase in your mortgage. If you're still on a low mortgage rate that you secured many years ago, you need to plan like it's the back end of next year, because if you do, then you'll be grateful when it comes to that point, because then you'll find that you'll have some money that you could perhaps draw on to help you cope with an elevated mortgage for a period of time. For savers, the reality is savings rates have been coming down. So we update savings tables every week. We'll put a link in the notes of the podcast. The best rates are coming down, and as we've seen, when interest rates were going up, so when the base rate was pushing up, the banks weren't very quick to catch up with reality. In fact, a lot of them still haven't. And the interest rates on savings accounts were disappointing, but you could get some good rates if you shopped around. You get more than 5%, even as much as 6%. And NS&I obviously brought out a product where you could get 6% for a year, which was then quickly pulled. The idea was that National Savings and Investments hoped that the rest of the market would follow them. The banks would be inclined to raise their interest rates, but that didn't really happen. So the best rates are disappearing. So if you're being hesitant about securing a decent savings rate and you can lock your money away for a period of time, then you may want to think about it, because one thing you can be certain of, when interest rates, the base rate I'm talking about, starts to fall, whenever that day is, you know that bank account interest rates are going to start to plummet. So the savings accounts are going to fall, but perhaps their loan rates, so the mortgage rates, won't fall as quickly. So I was talking to somebody, just to finish on this, to give you a dynamic. If you've ever watched the Olympics, and I can't remember the event, what it's called, so remind me if you listen to the podcast, but if you've ever seen in the velodrome when the cyclists are going round and they're racing each other, but they don't want to be out front, and they start to sit there and start to climb up the side of the velodrome track, trying to force somebody to go in front to get the air resistance, because they want to trail behind them. They want to be in their slipstream. And what ends up happening, you get this bizarre race that actually everyone's almost stood completely still. That's what the mortgage market's like. So what happens is eventually in those races, somebody will start to go around and someone suddenly makes a break for the front, and then they all panic and start chasing that person. They go round and round and round, trying to slipstream each other, and then you get to the finish. So the time isn't really relevant, but it's who comes first. And that's how the mortgage market works, because what you'll get is all the lenders will try and keep their rates at a certain level elevated for profit, and also they are worried about where rates will go. Then someone will make a break and try and have a lower rate, and then the others might suddenly catch up with them, but then they'll pull back, and because they don't want to be flooded with customers. And so what you get is this really sort of cat and mouse scenario. So you won't see mortgage rates come plummeting down. They start to try and edge, and then eventually when people break from the pack, they all start to follow at some point. So that is what's likely to happen when the base rate starts to come down. Mortgage rates will be a bit delayed. Savings rates, on the other hand, they're much more like the marathon, when you get a pack of people running together and people try and stay with the pack. They don't want to necessarily go way out in front too early. And so when you had the NS&I, they were like the pace setter who would try to get everybody to run a bit faster, and no one did. They all stayed in the pack. That's the equivalent. So that's the dynamic. So you understand, and now we're at the peak. Things have changed. Savers, you might want to look at locking your money away if you can afford to, because rates aren't going to get much better. Borrowers, the choice is going to become a little bit more difficult, so make sure you seek advice.
Okay, so that's it. We are done for this week. If you want to get in touch with Damien or myself, you can do so in the usual way. It's Damien@moneytothemasses.com or Andy@moneytothemasses.com. It's always great to hear your feedback and ideas for future shows. Don't forget, we've got the Facebook community group. As always, it's facebook.com/groups/Money to the Masses. And of course, we've got our YouTube channel. Just search for Money to the Masses in YouTube, and please do subscribe to that if you can. Damien is always busy in the studio recording videos every week to go on our YouTube channel.
And funny you say that, Andy. I've just recorded a video about the best current account switching offers, which we do every month. And there have been lots of changes in that space, and you can get £200 now for switching to a particular building society. But also, what is interesting, there's a new offer where you can get cashback for just opening a new account without switching your existing current account. So that is interesting. So you can find that on our YouTube channel.
And so that's it. We're done for this week. Until next time.
Until next time.